When life falls apart and betrayal strikes, can we rise again? This is the story of Eva Matthews, an ordinary woman who faced the unimaginable and rebuilt her life with strength and purpose. From heartbreak to triumph, Eva's journey shows that even in our darkest moments, we have the power to transform. How did she overcome it all? Find out in this story of resilience and redemption. Like, share, and subscribe to witness more incredible transformations. The small town of Larkspur was a place where time seemed to slow down. A tranquil little oasis nestled at the edge of a sprawling forest. Its cobblestone streets and vintage storefronts painted a picture of simplicity, a world away from the bustle of city life. It was here that Eva and Luca had built their life, a life filled with laughter, love, and plans for the future. And today, they were celebrating their 5th wedding anniversary. The kind of anniversary that marked not just the passage of time, but the promise of so much more to come. The morning had started with a perfect stillness, the kind that only an autumn day could offer. The air was crisp, the leaves above them a vibrant blend of gold, orange, and scarlet, swaying lazily in the wind. Eva sat beside Luca in their car, her hand resting comfortably in his, the soft hum of the engine, the only sound breaking the silence as they cruised down the winding road that led out of Larkspur. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Eva said, her voice light but full of meaning, the kind that only a milestone like this could bring. She gazed out the window at the changing leaves, a quiet smile on her lips. Luca glanced at her, his deep brown eyes sparkling with affection. "Yeah, we have, and it feels like we're just getting started." The conversation flowed easily, like it always did between them. The years of marriage had only strengthened their bond, their shared dreams turning into plans, their plans turning into reality. They had talked about this day for so long, the anniversary getaway to the mountains, just the two of them, a chance to unwind and reconnect. But there was something more, something deeper in their conversation today. "Maybe we should start thinking about a family," Eva said, her voice soft but hopeful. Luca's gaze shifted back to the road, a hint of a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "I think we're ready, don't you?" Eva nodded, her heart swelling with happiness at the thought. They had always dreamed of a house filled with laughter, of children running through the halls, of a life built on love. They had both agreed that once their careers were stable, they would start a family. And now, it felt like the time was finally right. For a few brief moments, everything felt perfect. The world outside their car window seemed to blur into a beautiful tapestry, and the future stretched out before them like an open road. Eva squeezed Luca's hand, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over her. She was with the love of her life. They were headed to the mountains, and they were talking about starting a family. Everything was falling into place. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. The tranquility of the moment was shattered in an instant. A sharp screeching noise pierced the air, followed by the violent sound of tires skidding on asphalt. Eva's eyes shot wide open, her heart leaping into her throat as Luca's face turned pale in an instant. A massive truck, barreling down the road, veered suddenly into their lane, sending a jolt of panic through their bodies. "Luca, look out!" Eva screamed, her voice a mixture of fear and urgency. In that split second, time seemed to stretch into eternity. Luca's hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled force, swerving to the right in an attempt to avoid the impending collision. Eva's breath caught in her chest, her body tense as the world outside seemed to spin into chaos. The screeching of metal, the thud of impact, then nothing. Darkness swallowed her whole. Eva could hear nothing but the ringing in her ears. Her body was weightless, as though it was suspended in time. Her last thought before the world went black was a fleeting image of Luca's face, his expression twisted in fear, before it too disappeared into the abyss. The next thing she knew, she was conscious again, but in a way that felt completely foreign. Her body felt strange, heavy, and her limbs ached in ways she couldn't comprehend. The bright, cold lights of the hospital room above her felt harsh against her eyes, and the sterile smell of antiseptic clung to the air. Eva blinked, trying to make sense of her surroundings, but the world felt like it was spinning out of control. A nurse was at her side almost immediately, her voice gentle and calming. "You're awake. How are you feeling?" she asked, placing a soft hand on Eva's arm. But Eva's mind was still in a fog, and the pain that lanced through her body made it hard to concentrate. What happened? Eva managed to croak, her throat dry and tight. You were in an accident, Eva. It's going to be okay, the nurse said soothingly. Just take it slow. You're in the hospital now. You're safe. But safety was a fleeting comfort when the words she heard next tore through her heart like a blade. You have a severe spinal injury, the doctor explained later, his voice clinical but laced with an undertone of sympathy. There's a high chance you'll remain paralyzed from the waist down. Eva's world crumbled. The future she had envisioned, a life of adventure, family, and love, vanished in that single, devastating moment. It was as if the life she had known was being ripped from her, replaced with a harsh, unrelenting uncertainty. Her eyes searched desperately for Luca, who had been sitting quietly at the edge of the room, his face pale, his hands clenched in his lap. She wanted him to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but when she met his gaze, something inside her twisted. There was no warmth in his eyes, no love, just emptiness. He muttered something, barely audible. I didn't sign up for this. The words hit her harder than any physical injury ever could. She felt a sharp pain in her chest, a stabbing realization that Luca, the man she had married, the man she had built her life with, was slipping away from her. Days passed, but the feeling didn't change. Luca's visits grew shorter. He no longer brought flowers or even a kind word. His presence was distant, his silence almost suffocating. He didn't know how to handle her new reality, and soon Eva realized that he wasn't the person she thought he was. The man who had promised to love her in sickness and in health had become a ghost, unwilling to confront the life they had once dreamed of together. Eva was left with nothing but the cold, sterile walls of the hospital room and the overwhelming fear of what came next. The road they had once walked together now seemed like an untraveled path, one she had to walk alone. And in that moment, Eva knew that her life, her world, would never be the same again. The first thing Eva became aware of as her senses slowly returned to her was the unyielding, sharp pain in her body. A kind of pain that felt like it was coming from every part of her at once, yet was somehow distant, muffled, as if she were trapped between two worlds. She tried to move, to feel her legs beneath her, but there was nothing. A coldness, a numbness that seemed to stretch endlessly from her waist down. She blinked against the harsh light above her, her head throbbing with each beat of her heart. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, mixing with the underlying bitterness of exhaustion that clung to her skin. The bed she lay in was soft, but it felt alien, like she was lying on someone else's life, not her own. The world outside the room was a blur, muffled by the walls that kept her confined to this new, cruel reality. Her breath hitched in her chest as she tried to remember what had happened. The memory of the crash surfaced like a violent wave, slamming into her with such force that it made her stomach churn. The truck, the screeching tires, the sudden, blinding terror, and then nothing. Eva's gaze moved across the room, taking in the sterile surroundings, the white walls, the beeping of machines keeping time with her pulse. A nurse entered quietly, her face a mask of practiced kindness. Eva, you're awake. How are you feeling? The nurse's voice was soft, soothing, but Eva could barely focus on the words. All she could think about was the emptiness in her legs, the impossibility of movement. What happened to me? Eva managed to whisper, her throat dry, her voice trembling with the weight of the question. She had a sense, an instinct, but hearing it aloud felt like a sentence she wasn't ready to accept. The nurse paused for a moment, as if searching for the right way to deliver the news. You were in an accident, she said gently. You sustained a spinal injury. I'm afraid it's likely you'll remain paralyzed from the waist down. The words hung in the air like a death knell, a heavy fog descending upon her mind. Paralyzed. The truth slammed into her with the force of a freight train. She couldn't move. Not anymore. The life she had imagined for herself, the future, the dreams, the family, was now an unreachable star, just out of her grasp. The nurse continued talking, but Eva wasn't listening anymore. She couldn't hear the reassurances, the explanations of treatment plans. It all felt like static in her ears. She was too consumed by the overwhelming sense of loss, the unshakable weight of the reality that had just settled over her. Where was Luca? Her eyes darted around the room, finally landing on him. He was sitting in a chair by the window, his back turned to her, staring out at the city skyline. His posture was rigid, distant. The man who had once been her everything, the man who had promised to walk through life with her, hand in hand, now seemed like a stranger, a cold, detached figure sitting in the corner of her world. Luca. Her voice barely made it past her lips, a fragile whisper that seemed to vanish into the sterile air. He turned to face her, but his expression was unreadable, a mask she couldn't penetrate. He didn't rush to her side, didn't take her hand or comfort her with the reassuring words she longed to hear. Instead, he simply met her gaze with something close to detachment, his lips pressing together in a tight line. "I never signed up for this," Luca said, his words cold, calculated, as if he had rehearsed them 1,000 times. His eyes avoided hers, flickering around the room in discomfort, as though he couldn't bear to look at her for too long. Eva felt as though the ground had been ripped from beneath her. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted with her life, was standing there, his eyes full of something dark, something unfamiliar. His words were like a punch to the gut, cruel, heartless, and they left her gasping for air, struggling to process the devastating weight of his abandonment. She tried to speak, to protest, to tell him that she hadn't chosen this. She hadn't chosen to lose everything, but the words stuck in her throat, thick with disbelief. Luca took a slow breath, his gaze now softening ever so slightly, but the warmth that had once been there was gone, replaced by something colder, harder. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for you to be like this." He gestured vaguely toward her body, as if it were something he could discard, something he didn't want to deal with. Eva's heart sank, each word tearing into her with the precision of a blade. She wanted to scream, to tell him how unfair it was, how his abandonment was the last thing she needed, how she had loved him with every ounce of her being, only for him to turn his back when she needed him most. But all she could do was stare at him, her vision clouded by a flood of tears she couldn't hold back. Luca stood up then, as if the very air in the room had become suffocating. His movements were stiff, reluctant, and he avoided looking at her as he headed toward the door. "I'll come back later," he said, the words falling from his lips with little conviction. Eva didn't speak. She didn't know what to say. How could she? How could she plead for the love of a man who so clearly no longer saw her as the woman he had promised to cherish? As Luca left, the door clicked shut behind him with a sound that felt final. And in that moment, Eva felt as though her world had crumbled entirely. The room, once filled with the comforting hum of life and shared dreams, now felt like a tomb, cold, lifeless, and utterly empty. The hours dragged on, her mind replaying his words over and over again. "I didn't sign up for this. I didn't ask for you to be like this." Each repetition made her feel more broken, more isolated, as if the very foundation of her life was slipping away into nothingness. The pain in her body was nothing compared to the ache in her chest. She wasn't just paralyzed physically. She was paralyzed emotionally, trapped in a world where the person she had trusted the most had turned his back on her. And now she was left alone to face the reality of a life she hadn't chosen. She closed her eyes, trying to find some comfort in the darkness behind her lids. But even there, all she saw was emptiness. Eva had never imagined this, never dreamed that love could fracture so easily, so cruelly. She had always believed in the promise of better or worse, but Luca's words were a harsh reminder that some promises were never meant to last. The hours turned to days, and as they passed, Eva's body began its slow journey of healing. But her heart felt irreparably shattered. With each visit Luca made, his presence grew colder. His silence was louder than any argument, and his indifference was more painful than any words he could say. He stopped bringing her flowers. He stopped sitting by her side. He stopped pretending that he still cared. Eva knew, in the pit of her stomach, that the man she had loved, the man who had once been her future, was slipping away, piece by piece. And she was left to face this new life alone, with nothing but the crushing weight of the unknown pressing down on her. The days in the hospital stretched on, each one like an eternity. Eva began to realize that the person she thought she knew had disappeared, leaving behind someone she couldn't recognize. She was alone now. And for the first time, isolating truth began to settle in. She would have to find her own way forward, alone. The house felt different now. Once, it had been a place of warmth and promise, where every corner was infused with memories of laughter, shared dreams, and the quiet hum of a love that felt invincible. But now, it felt like a shell, empty and cold, every inch of it echoing with the silence of a love that had begun to wither and die. Eva spent the morning staring out of the large windows that overlooked the small garden they had once tended together. The flowers they had planted in the spring were wilting now, their bright colors fading as if reflecting the fading hope in her own heart. The room, once alive with conversation and shared moments, had become a tomb of forgotten promises. The furniture was still arranged as it had been, neat and orderly, but it was all just furniture. There was no life in it anymore. Luca's visits had become fewer and fewer. At first, he would come home in the evenings, his footsteps a familiar sound, the rustling of his keys as he entered, the soft murmur of his voice in greeting. But now, it was rare for him to stay more than an hour. He would sit across from her, his eyes darting to his phone more often than to her face. And when they did talk, it was about things that didn't matter, trivialities that never seemed to touch the weight of their reality. "I'll be back later," he would say, the words slipping from his lips without a second thought as he grabbed his jacket and left. And she would sit in the silence that followed, her heart sinking with every click of the door. There were days when he didn't come home at all, and Eva would lie awake in their bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of her own breathing in the darkness. She could feel the distance between them, a chasm that grew wider with each passing day. And it wasn't just the physical absence that stung. It was the emotional desertion that had taken root in their relationship. Luca no longer looked at her the way he used to. The warmth in his eyes had turned to something colder, more distant. The tenderness of his touch had been replaced with awkwardness, as if he was afraid that his skin would somehow make contact with the reality of her injury. Eva noticed it most when he helped her into bed. The way his hands trembled as they guided her body into position, his fingers stiff and hesitant as they adjusted the blankets around her. There was no comfort in his touch anymore, only a kind of mechanical care, as if he were doing his duty, but nothing more. One afternoon, as the sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows on the floor, Luca came home later than usual. His face was drawn, his eyes tired, and there was a faint smell of alcohol on his breath. Eva had been waiting for him, sitting on the couch, her gaze fixed on the front door as she listened for his footsteps. She knew he was upset, but she had learned not to ask too many questions. He no longer offered explanations for his absences, and she no longer had the energy to demand them. He dropped his keys on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, his back to her. Eva couldn't help but feel the familiar sense of dread settle in her chest. She hadn't seen him like this in months. The silence between them was suffocating, pressing down on her until she could hardly breathe. "Luca," she called softly, her voice trembling despite herself. He turned then, his face hardening as he looked at her. His eyes, once so full of warmth and love, were now devoid of anything resembling affection. There was only a kind of resignation there, an emptiness that made Eva's heart ache. "I didn't think our life would turn out like this," he said, his voice flat, distant. Eva flinched, the words stinging more than she expected. It wasn't just the admission of his unhappiness, it was the fact that he had said it so easily, without remorse, as though he were speaking to a stranger. It was the weight of his indifference that hurt the most. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. What could she say? What could she say to the man she had once believed would be with her through everything, who had promised to love her, to cherish her, even in the worst of times? Now, it felt as though all of that was just gone. "I didn't ask for this," Luca continued, his voice hardening. "I didn't ask for you to be like this, for us to be like this." He gestured vaguely to the space between them, the hospital bed she now spent most of her time in, the empty rooms, the silence that had replaced their once joyful conversations. His words felt like a slap in the face, each one a jagged shard of truth that cut deep into her soul. Eva's throat tightened as she tried to process what he was saying, but the reality of it was suffocating. She was paralyzed, yes. But what hurt just as much was the knowledge that Luca had already checked out, emotionally, long before the accident had even happened. "I never signed up for this," he muttered, almost to himself, before turning away and retreating to their bedroom without another word. Eva sat there, staring at the space where he had been just moments before. His absence was like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. How had it come to this? How had they gone from being partners in every sense of the word to strangers living in the same house? How could he look at her, the woman he had promised to love through thick and thin, and see only the weight of her disability, the loss of the life they had once dreamed of together? The days began to blur together. Eva spent hours in the living room, staring out at the street, watching the world go by while she remained trapped in this house with a man who no longer wanted to be part of her world. Every corner, every room held memories of better times, times when she would have thought she could never be alone, times when Luca's love had felt like a safe harbor in the storm. Now, she was drowning in the silence. When Luca did return home, his visits were no longer a comfort. He would come in late, his eyes tired, his face closed off, and he would retreat to his side of the house, as if they were already living separate lives. Sometimes, he would leave again in the morning without so much as a word, leaving Eva to face the reality of their crumbling marriage all over again. In the quiet, Eva began to realize something she had been too afraid to admit before. Their marriage wasn't just fractured, it was crumbling, piece by piece, under the weight of her disability and his inability to cope with it. There was no more tenderness in his gaze, no more softness in his voice. There was only a man who had been worn thin by the burden of a life he hadn't chosen, a man who was slowly abandoning her, even as he stayed in the house. And as the days passed, the truth became clearer. The Luca she had once known, the Luca she had trusted with her heart, had left long before the accident. And in his place was a man she didn't recognize, someone who saw her injury, not her. Eva closed her eyes, the pain in her chest unbearable. She had been emotionally deserted, abandoned not just by Luca, but by the man she had once believed could face anything with her. And the worst part? She knew she was no longer just a victim of the accident. She was a victim of the man who had once vowed to love her forever. And that, perhaps, was the hardest thing to accept of all. Eva had spent days in a haze, trapped in the quiet prison of their home, where the memories of better times continued to haunt her. Each room, each corner held fragments of her past, images of laughter, of shared dreams, of a man who had once adored her. Now, everything felt distant, as if that life had belonged to someone else. She had been swallowed by the emptiness of her marriage, the relentless silence that stretched on day after day, and the steady, unyielding loneliness that pressed in from all sides. But one morning, as Eva sat by the window, her hands resting on her lap, a letter arrived. A simple, unassuming envelope that was about to change everything. It was addressed to her in elegant, flowing script, the kind of writing that suggested something important, something that carried weight. She didn't recognize the name of the sender at first. For a moment, she hesitated. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to let it sit unopened like so many other pieces of mail that had arrived over the months. Unread, forgotten, just another reminder of the life she was supposed to have had. But something urged her to open it. Maybe it was the sense of urgency in the back of her mind, the growing need for something, anything, that would break the monotony of her existence. With trembling hands, she tore the envelope open. Inside, she found a letter, the words printed neatly on crisp white paper. "Dear Eva, it is with great sorrow that I inform you of the passing of your distant relative, Eleanor Kingsley. Though you may not have known her well, she regarded you with great affection and has left you a substantial inheritance. Please find the details of your inheritance enclosed." Eva's fingers shook as she scanned the rest of the letter, her eyes widening in disbelief as the words began to sink in. Eleanor Kingsley had been a distant aunt, one she had barely remembered, but the inheritance was nothing short of life-changing. The letter detailed a fortune, an amount that was more than enough to provide for her needs, to change the course of her life, to rebuild herself from the wreckage of her past. The inheritance wasn't just a sum of money, it was freedom. For the first time since the accident, Eva felt a spark of something that had been absent for so long. Hope. Hope that, perhaps, she didn't have to stay stuck in the life that had been thrust upon her. Hope that she could rebuild herself, not as the woman abandoned by her husband, but as someone who could define her own future. Her breath caught in her chest as she read the letter over and over, as if trying to convince herself that it was real. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a mistake. This was happening, and it was happening to her. Eva felt the weight of the letter in her hands, the cold, tangible promise of a new beginning. It was as if the universe had decided in that moment to offer her a chance to escape, to offer her a way out. For the first time in months, she felt something stir within her, a stirring that began in her chest and spread outward like warmth, like light breaking through the darkness. Luca. The name surfaced in her mind, but for the first time, it didn't bring the same suffocating weight of sadness or disappointment. She had spent so much of her energy thinking about him, about the marriage that had crumbled beneath the weight of her injury, about the man who had once promised to love her and now couldn't even look at her. But that was before this letter, before the inheritance, before the possibility of a new life. Eva leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes as she let out a long, steady breath. She had been living in the shadow of her past for too long. It was time to step into the light. It was time to reclaim her life, not as a victim, not as the broken woman left behind, but as the woman who would forge her own path. She allowed herself a moment to dream again. The letter mentioned a secluded estate in the hills, an old family property that had been left to her. It was a sprawling estate with acres of land and a house that had been abandoned for years. The thought of it filled her with a strange sense of peace. It was far removed from the suffocating familiarity of her current life, far from the memories of Luca and the painful reminders of their failed marriage. It was a place where she could start fresh, a place where she could build something new, something that was all her own. She could feel the pull of the estate, the promise of the future it represented. It was a quiet haven where she could heal, where she could grow into the woman she was meant to be, strong, independent, and free from the chains of the life she had been trapped in. She could see herself there, surrounded by nature, the air thick with possibility. Eva didn't hesitate. The decision was made in an instant. She would go. She would leave the life she had been living behind and start over. She would take the inheritance, the fortune that had been given to her, and she would use it to rebuild, to redefine herself, to find a life where she was no longer defined by the accident or by Luca's desertion. She would live for herself, not for anyone else. In that moment, Eva made a vow to herself. She would not be the woman who was abandoned. She would be the woman who stood tall again, who learned to walk with confidence on her own, who made a life full of purpose and joy, without depending on anyone's love or approval. And as she looked out the window, toward the hills that held the promise of her future, she felt the first true sense of freedom she had known in a long time. The glimmer of hope that had flickered inside her began to burn brighter, and with it, she felt a sense of excitement that had been absent for far too long. It was the beginning of something new. It was the beginning of her journey, and she was finally ready to take the first step. Eva had always prided herself on her independence. It had been one of the things Luca had once admired about her. The way she navigated life with a quiet confidence, never asking for help, always determined to forge her own way. But now, as she sat in the backseat of a car heading toward the renowned rehabilitation center, that same independence felt like a distant memory, almost foreign to her. She was no longer the woman who had everything figured out. She was a woman who was learning, day by day, to rely on others, physically, emotionally, and mentally. The rehab center was nestled in the heart of the tranquil countryside, a place designed to help people heal, not just their bodies, but their souls. The sprawling grounds, dotted with ancient oak trees and wildflowers, felt like a sanctuary, a space where time slowed, and the outside world seemed to vanish into the distance. It was here, surrounded by the gentle sounds of nature, that Eva would begin the long, difficult process of rebuilding herself. As she entered the facility, she felt the familiar sting of vulnerability. The hallways were bright and sterile, lined with posters of patients triumphing over their disabilities, reminding her of the struggles and victories she had yet to experience. The rehab center was filled with patients of all ages, each one with their own story, their own fight. Some were recovering from accidents, some from strokes, and others from surgeries. But each one shared something in common with Eva. They were all trying to reclaim a part of themselves that had been lost. The first few days were a blur. Eva woke early each morning, her muscles sore from the exercises she had struggled through the day before. The therapists were kind, patient, but unyielding. They pushed her when she wanted to give up, encouraged her when she felt as though she couldn't take another step. And there were moments when she felt like a failure, moments when the frustration and exhaustion threatened to swallow her whole. She couldn't feel her legs. The reality of her condition was an unrelenting weight, but each time she wanted to quit, each time she thought of turning back, something inside her refused. "I didn't come this far to give up," she whispered to herself one night, her fingers gripping the bed rail as she tried to stretch her stiff limbs. She thought of the inheritance, the estate she had come to call her new home, the promise she had made to herself that she would no longer be a woman defined by tragedy. The next day, when the therapist guided her through a particularly grueling physical therapy session, Eva pushed harder. She felt the burn in her arms, the strain on her shoulders, but she refused to stop. Slowly, painfully, she began to feel the spark of hope once again. The spark she had felt the moment she decided to rebuild her life, to take control, to be the architect of her future. The pain she felt in her body was real, but it was a pain that came with progress. Each painful movement, each slow, measured step forward was a victory. Eva's first breakthrough came when she was able to lift herself from a wheelchair to a standing position, supported only by her therapist's hands. It was a simple motion for some, but for Eva, it felt like a mountain had been moved. The sense of accomplishment that flooded her was overwhelming. She didn't care that her legs were still numb, or that she was far from walking again. She had proven to herself that she still had the strength to fight, to push past the limits of what she thought was possible. The center became a place of growth, not just for her body, but for her mind. Eva began attending group therapy sessions where she met other patients who had their own stories of loss and resilience. There was Leah, a woman in her 40s who had been paralyzed in a car accident 5 years ago and had lost her job and her family. Then there was Henry, a jovial man in his late 60s who had suffered a stroke and was slowly learning to speak again. And there was Megan, a young woman who had recently undergone a double amputation and was fighting through the psychological barriers that came with such an abrupt change. They all shared their stories, their pain, their fears, but most importantly, they shared their victories. In these circles, Eva found a new kind of family, a community of people who understood her in ways that no one else could. There were no judgments here, no pity, only empathy, and the unspoken promise that no one would be left behind. For the first time in months, Eva didn't feel alone. She was surrounded by people who got it, the ones who knew what it meant to fight against your own body, against your own limitations. During one of their weekly group sessions, Leah asked Eva how she was coping with the change. "At first, I thought I was done. I didn't think I could handle it. But I've realized I can't just let the accident define me," Eva said, her voice shaky at first, but growing stronger with each word. "I have to keep going. I'm learning that healing is about more than just what happens to your body. It's about how you choose to respond to it. It's about the strength you find when you have nothing left to give." Leah smiled, her eyes bright with understanding. "You're stronger than you think, Eva. We all are." Eva nodded, feeling the weight of those words sink in. As weeks turned into months, Eva's physical strength improved. She began using a walker, and though each step was slow, she felt a sense of pride that was unlike anything she had experienced before. But more importantly, she began to realize something even more powerful. Recovery wasn't just about walking again. It was about finding her own inner strength, her own will to live beyond the accident. It was about understanding that the mind and the body were inextricably linked, that healing was not just a matter of muscles and bones, but of mind and heart. The challenges were far from over, but Eva no longer feared them. Each day was an opportunity to grow, to redefine herself, to rewrite the story of her life. She was no longer just the woman who had been left behind. She was the woman who had chosen to rise, the woman who was reclaiming her future, one step at a time. And as she looked out over the peaceful countryside, the sun dipping low in the sky, she realized that she was no longer running from her past. She had embraced it, accepted it, and now she was walking toward a future of her own making, a future where anything was possible. Eva sat at her sleek mahogany desk, staring out the window of her home office. The view of the hills and the sprawling grounds that surrounded her new life was serene, but her thoughts were elsewhere, focused on something much bigger than herself. As she continued her rehabilitation at the center, a place that had become both her sanctuary and her battleground, she began to see the stark realities that so many others faced. Every day, she interacted with people whose stories mirrored her own, and yet they had to struggle for access to the same care that had made her journey even remotely possible. Eva's heart ached as she listened to their stories of financial hardship, of being turned away from places that could have given them a chance to heal, simply because they couldn't afford the exorbitant costs of specialized therapy. It wasn't just the physical recovery that she had come to understand as vital. It was the support, the guidance, the community, the knowledge that someone truly cared about your recovery. It wasn't something that could be bought, and yet it felt like it was reserved for only a select few. But Eva knew better than anyone that the ability to heal, to rebuild a life, was not a privilege. It was a human right. Her fingers hovered over her keyboard, uncertainty stirring in her chest. But it wasn't the uncertainty of not knowing what she wanted to do. It was the weight of knowing exactly what needed to be done, and the enormity of that task. She'd fought for her own recovery, and now she was ready to fight for others. The idea of the Rise Foundation had begun as a small, fleeting thought, one that emerged after a conversation with Leah at the rehab center. They had been talking about how the disparity in access to quality rehabilitation services had impacted so many lives. Some of the most driven, most resilient people Eva had ever met were struggling to find a way forward because they simply didn't have the resources. That conversation had lit a fire in her, and now, months later, she couldn't ignore the pull. She had the means, the knowledge, and the drive to make a difference. And most importantly, she had the passion to turn the idea into something real. With the inheritance she had received, a vast sum that had once felt like a safety net, she saw it now as the key to creating something that would impact not just her life, but the lives of countless others. The Rise Foundation would provide access to affordable, high-quality rehabilitation services for people facing life-altering injuries, whether from accidents, strokes, or debilitating diseases. It would offer not just physical therapy, but emotional support, job training, and access to a network of professionals who could help people rebuild their lives from the inside out. Eva had learned firsthand the transformative power of therapy, of surrounding oneself with the right people, and of believing in the possibility of recovery. She wanted to give that same chance to others, to provide them with the resources she had been lucky enough to find. Resources that many would never have access to without help. Over the next few weeks, she poured her energy into creating the foundation. She researched nonprofit laws, consulted with experts, and hired a team of passionate individuals who shared her vision. The mission of the foundation was clear: to ensure that no one who needed rehabilitation would be left behind, no matter their financial situation. She wanted the foundation to be a lifeline for those who had been abandoned by the system, just as she had once feared she would be. Eva's office became the headquarters for the Rise Foundation, her sanctuary where her thoughts could turn into action. Every afternoon, she would sit at her desk, surrounded by folders of proposals, grant applications, and budget plans. But what drove her wasn't the paperwork. It was the faces of the people she had met along the way, the ones who had shared their stories of struggle, of isolation, of longing for a chance to fight. Their faces kept her focused, reminding her why this was worth it. And then there were the community centers. Eva wanted the Rise Foundation to have a tangible grassroots presence. She began reaching out to local community centers where people who had suffered life-altering injuries often found themselves without support. They were places where hope was hard to come by, where families struggled to keep their loved ones engaged, where resources were scarce. Through these partnerships, Eva arranged for the foundation to offer free workshops where physical therapists, nutritionists, and mental health professionals could volunteer their time to speak with patients and their families. It was a way to begin building a network of support, to show people that there was hope, that recovery didn't have to be a solitary, daunting journey. At first, it was small. A few people attended the workshops. A few more heard about the foundation through word of mouth. But as the foundation gained traction, so did the number of people who reached out for help. There were stories of tears of relief, of people finding the courage to try again, of families coming together after feeling like they'd been scattered by the weight of their circumstances. Eva found herself overwhelmed with gratitude, grateful for the ability to give, and for the trust that others placed in the foundation. One of the most rewarding aspects of the foundation was watching people not just heal physically, but grow mentally. Eva had seen too many individuals, many of whom had been in her position not so long ago, begin to reconnect with life, to find purpose again. Some found new careers in rehabilitation, while others reconnected with old hobbies they thought they'd lost forever. It wasn't just about healing, it was about reinvention, about finding new paths when the old ones were no longer available. And then there were the success stories, the ones that brought her to tears every single time. There was Carla, a young woman who had been in a car accident similar to Eva's and had been told she would never walk again. After 6 months of dedicated therapy, she was on crutches, slow but steady, with a smile on her face that lit up the room every time she walked into it. Or Anthony, a former athlete who had sustained a spinal cord injury in a diving accident, who had thought his world was over. Now, through the foundation, he had rediscovered his love for coaching and was training others who faced the same kind of challenge he had. Eva found herself drawn deeper into the foundation's work, feeling as though she was becoming the person she had always wanted to be, the person who made a difference, who could touch lives in a way that transcended the pain of her own past. For the first time in months, the shadow of loneliness that had once haunted her seemed to fade. Through the foundation, Eva had created something that gave her a sense of purpose beyond herself, something that was truly bigger than any personal tragedy. And she was not doing it alone. Her team at the foundation, the therapists, the volunteers, the patients, together, they were creating a ripple effect that would extend far beyond the hills of her estate and into communities all over the country. In a way, the Rise Foundation was Eva's rebirth, a new life that emerged from the ashes of what had once been her greatest loss. It was her answer to the question of what came next, what she could do with the time she had left. And as she sat back in her chair one evening, looking at the smiling faces in the photos of the first group of patients she had helped, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The pain was still there, a constant companion, but now it had a purpose, a meaning that went beyond survival. Eva had risen, and through the foundation, she was helping others rise too. The studio was sterile and bright, the lights blindingly hot as Eva sat in front of a camera, her hands folded on her lap, the weight of the moment settling over her like a heavy blanket. It had been months since she'd first started speaking publicly about the Rise Foundation, but this was different. This wasn't just a speech to a room of donors or a local workshop. This was her first live interview, her first real moment to share her story with the world. Behind her, a producer fiddled with the camera, while the host, a woman named Julia, reviewed her notes. Eva could feel her heart pounding, but she focused on her breathing, steadying herself. The journey from the hospital room to this point had been long, painful, and filled with doubts. But now, as she prepared to speak, a quiet confidence settled within her. The strength she had found in herself over the past year, through the dark, lonely moments, through the growth and healing, through the creation of the Rise Foundation, was no longer something she hid. It was something she wore like armor. Welcome back to Morning News Today. Julia's voice cut through the tension, her warm smile directed at the camera. Today, we're joined by someone whose journey has inspired millions. Eva Matthews, founder of the Rise Foundation. Eva, thank you so much for being here. Eva smiled back, her nerves easing just a little. Thank you for having me, Julia. The camera zoomed in slightly as Julia began the interview, her tone gentle, as though she already knew the depth of Eva's story. "Eva," she began, "you've gone through a life-changing event that many people can't even imagine. An accident that left you paralyzed, followed by a painful abandonment by your husband. How did you find the strength to push forward from such a devastating moment?" Eva took a slow, deep breath, her mind instantly drifting back to that day, the moment when everything had changed. She thought of the pain, the confusion, the helplessness. But she also thought of the quiet resilience that had emerged in her. The truth was, her recovery hadn't been a single sudden moment of clarity. It had been a slow, painful climb, one small victory at a time. "It wasn't easy," Eva started, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "I woke up in that hospital bed and everything had been stripped away. My life, my independence, my dreams, they all felt like they'd been taken from me in an instant." She paused, gathering her thoughts, then continued, her voice growing firmer. "But in those first few days, I realized that I had a choice. I could let the anger and the fear consume me, or I could take control of the one thing I still had left, my will to keep going." Julia nodded, clearly moved. "And you chose to keep going. How did that lead to the Rise Foundation?" Eva looked out the window briefly, as if trying to see the very path she'd walked, then turned back to the camera. "When I started my recovery, I was lucky. I had access to the best therapists, the best care. But as I talked to other people in the same position, I realized how many weren't as fortunate. People who couldn't afford the services they needed, who were left in the shadows, forgotten." Her voice softened, then steadied as she continued. "I knew I couldn't just sit back and ignore that. I couldn't keep what I had learned to myself, so I started the Rise Foundation, to give people the resources, the support, and the chance to rebuild their lives, to help them rise." For a moment, there was silence in the studio, as Julia let her words sink in. "That's incredible," Julia said, her voice full of admiration. "And now, Rise is helping so many people find their strength again. Your story has touched so many lives. Do you have any particular moments or people that stand out to you since starting the foundation?" Eva thought for a moment, her eyes scanning the room as though searching for the faces that had shaped her journey. "There are so many," she said, a smile pulling at her lips. "But if I had to pick one, it would be Carla. She came to us right after a car accident. She'd been told she would never walk again, that she should accept her new reality. But when she walked into our center, there was this spark in her eyes, this refusal to give up. She worked so hard. And now she's not just walking. She's training to become a physical therapist herself. She wants to give others the same second chance that she had." Eva paused, her voice thick with emotion, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to relive that day. It was a moment of pure victory, not just for Carla, but for herself too. It was proof that recovery didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was communal. It was a chain of support that could never be broken, so long as people like her were willing to reach out and offer a hand. Julia leaned forward, clearly touched by Eva's words. "That's truly remarkable. Your story is one of strength, of resilience. And now, it's also a story of hope for others. It's clear that you've turned your pain into something powerful. I know people across the country are reaching out to you, inspired by your work with the Rise Foundation." Eva nodded. "Yes. The outpouring of support has been overwhelming. People from all walks of life have contacted us. Patients, their families, even people who've had no personal connection to injury or disability, but who just want to help. I never expected this level of response. But it's a reminder that when you open yourself up to vulnerability, when you share your truth, it resonates with others. We're all more connected than we realize." As the interview continued, Eva found herself speaking more freely, the words flowing easily now. She spoke not just about the foundation, but about the journey she had taken to get here. She talked about the loneliness and despair she had felt in the early days after the accident. She talked about her difficult path to forgiveness, not just of Luca, but of herself. She spoke about the healing power of community, of being surrounded by people who believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. It wasn't easy, laying her soul bare on national television. But as she spoke, she knew it was worth it. If even one person watching felt inspired to reach out, to fight for their own recovery, to make their own rise, it would all be worth it. The interview wrapped up, and Julia thanked her for sharing her story. Eva nodded, grateful for the opportunity to be heard. As the lights dimmed and the crew began packing up, Eva felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She'd said everything she needed to say. And in that moment, she knew the impact of her words would stretch far beyond this studio, beyond this interview. Her story, her foundation, Rise, was becoming something bigger than herself. It was becoming a movement. People from all over the world began reaching out, offering donations, volunteer hours, and support. They shared their own stories, their own struggles, their own dreams for a better future. The Rise Foundation had been born from Eva's pain, but now it was becoming a beacon of hope for others. And in the quiet moments of reflection, Eva knew that she had found not just a new purpose, but a new family. A family bound by the belief that no matter how far we fall, we all have the capacity to rise again. The evening had come to life in a swirl of glittering lights and soft music. The grand ballroom of the prestigious venue sparkled with luxury, crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over tables adorned with white roses and silver candelabras. The guests, impeccably dressed, chatted and laughed in clusters, the hum of their conversations creating a background of quiet celebration. This was no ordinary night. This was the culmination of years of hard work, a night dedicated to raising funds and awareness for the Rise Foundation, a foundation that had grown into something far greater than Eva had ever imagined. Eva stood at the center of the room, dressed in a sleek black gown that contrasted with the softness of the pastels around her. Her wheelchair was positioned beside her, but she no longer felt defined by it. In the time since the gala had been planned, she had become accustomed to being the face of the Rise Foundation, no longer just the woman who had been abandoned and left broken, but the leader of a movement, a voice for those who had no voice. She had walked through her pain, rebuilt herself piece by piece, and now, surrounded by so many of the people who had helped her, she could finally feel proud. The guests were seated now, the sound of silverware clinking against fine china, and the soft murmur of polite conversation as the evening's program began. Eva took a deep breath, her nerves now under control, her mind focused on the words she needed to say. She had spoken to crowds before, but tonight something felt different. This was a celebration, not just of the foundation's success, but of the journey that had brought her here. The stage was set for her speech. The spotlight turned to her as the microphone was handed to her. Eva wheeled herself up to the podium, her hands steady, her heart calm. As she spoke, her voice rang with the conviction of someone who had overcome her deepest fears and doubts. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice clear, the words flowing easily. "I am so grateful for each and every one of you here tonight. What you're doing tonight is more than just contributing to a cause. You are part of a movement, one that's about hope, about healing, and about the belief that no matter how deep the wounds, we have the power to rise again." She paused, taking in the faces of the people who had supported her, the therapists who had worked with her tirelessly, the volunteers who had given their time selflessly, the donors who had believed in her vision even when she hadn't believed in herself. She was no longer just Eva Matthews, a woman who had lost everything. She was a leader, surrounded by a network of people who shared in her mission, who understood the depth of what it meant to rebuild. Her gaze moved across the room, and her thoughts drifted back to those dark days in the hospital, when she had felt abandoned by everything she had known. The absence of Luca, the man she had once shared her dreams with, had haunted her for so long. And yet, here she was, stronger than she had ever been, surrounded by this new family of people who had given her the courage to face the future. She felt a sense of peace she had never thought possible. "I've learned that healing isn't just about the body," she continued, her voice softer now, as if sharing a secret with the crowd. "It's about the mind, the spirit, and, most importantly, the people you allow into your life. My journey, our journey, has been shaped by the love, support, and belief of the people who have walked beside me. We rise together. We are stronger together." The applause was warm, but it was not the sound of the crowd that she focused on. It was the quiet echo of her own words. She wasn't just speaking to them. She was speaking to herself. This was her testimony, her declaration of strength, not just for the foundation, but for the woman she had become. And in that moment, as she looked out over the crowd, it was as if all the pieces of her past, her heartbreak, her struggles, her losses, finally fell into place. But then, just as the night seemed to be at its peak, something shifted. She noticed someone in the crowd, someone she hadn't seen in months. He was standing at the edge of the room, looking unsure, his eyes scanning the faces of the guests before they landed on hers. Her breath caught in her throat. Luca. Eva's pulse quickened, the familiar rush of emotions flooding her all at once. He looked different, older, wearier. There was a new vulnerability in his eyes, the kind that only time and regret could create. And for a moment, it felt as though the air had thickened around her. She felt herself freeze. The man who had once been the center of her world, the one she had loved so deeply, had returned. And yet, this man no longer had any hold on her heart. Luca hesitated for only a moment before making his way toward her. As he approached, Eva straightened in her chair, her hand instinctively resting on the arm of the wheelchair, as though preparing for whatever came next. Eva, he said softly, his voice uncertain. I heard about the foundation. I've seen what you've accomplished. I'm proud of you. I've made a mess of things, and I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted to tell you, I'm sorry. I know I hurt you. I know I walked away when you needed me the most, but I want to make it right. I want to try again. Can we talk? The words hung in the air like a weight, and for a moment, Eva found herself staring at him. This man who had once been her everything, the one who had promised to stand by her side through it all. But in the silence that followed, Eva realized something. The pain, the betrayal, the devastation she had felt when he left her, it no longer had the power to define her. She had rebuilt herself, not just physically, but emotionally, and part of that process was learning to let go of the past. She took a slow breath and met his gaze with calm certainty. Luca, she began, her voice firm but not unkind. I've had a long time to think about everything, about us, about what happened, and I've come to understand something important. Part of my healing was realizing that I needed to let go of the past. I needed to forgive you, yes, but I also needed to let go of the idea that I needed you to move forward. You left me when I was broken, and I survived. I thrived. I found strength that I didn't know I had. Luca's face faltered, a hint of pain flickering in his eyes, but Eva pressed on. I've built something incredible now, Luca. I've created a family, a new family, through this foundation, and that's who I am now. That's who I've become. And I can't go back to who I was before. I have no place for the past in my future. There was a long silence between them, the room suddenly too still, too heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. But Eva felt no desire to fill it. This was the truth she needed to speak. And as she looked at Luca, this man who had once been everything to her, she felt no bitterness, no longing, just peace. I'm sorry, Luca whispered, his voice thick with regret. Eva gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Goodbye, Luca. As he turned and walked away, the weight on Eva's chest seemed to lift. She had done it. She had let go. And as the music swelled and the evening continued, she realized that she had finally freed herself from the shadows of the past. The Rise Foundation, her true family, stood beside her now. And with them, Eva knew she was finally home. The air outside the courthouse was thick with tension, the kind of pressure that only comes from standing at the crossroads of personal and public war. Eva stood at the foot of the grand steps, her eyes set forward, her posture straight, despite the weight of the day pressing down on her. The sound of clicking cameras and reporters shouting questions filled the air around her, but she remained calm, a quiet determination in her gaze. This was not the path she had imagined for herself when she had first created the Rise Foundation. She had envisioned moments like these filled with celebration, with the recognition of the lives she had changed, the people she had helped. But life, as she had learned, was rarely as simple as it seemed. And now, standing here, facing not only the public scrutiny, but the darkness of an old betrayal, she realized that this fight wasn't just about her. It was about everything the foundation represented, everything she had worked so tirelessly to build. Her phone buzzed in her pocket as she entered the law office, and she answered quickly. It was her lawyer, Jonathan Hale, his voice steady but filled with urgency. Eva, They're circulating the rumors already. We've received several calls from media outlets, and I'm hearing whispers that Luca is telling people you've used your foundation for personal gain, that you've been manipulating donors and using the organization as a front to launder money. Eva's stomach tightened at the words. It had been only a few weeks since Luca had appeared at the gala, attempting to reopen old wounds. She had expected some form of regret, perhaps a plea for redemption. But this was something entirely different. He had resorted to something darker, something petty. Is he seriously doing this? Eva's voice was low, but sharp, the fury beneath it barely contained. We have all the evidence, Jonathan continued, but you need to stay focused. We're filing the defamation suit today. This is no longer about your personal life. This is about the integrity of your work, the Rise Foundation. We're not just going to sit back and let him destroy everything you've built. Eva took a long breath and nodded, though she knew Jonathan couldn't see her over the phone. I understand. Let's do it. As she entered the law office, the reality of what was ahead of her settled in. The legal team had been preparing for this moment since the rumors had first started spreading. They knew Luca's attack would be calculated, but Eva was determined to protect everything that had become her life's work. This wasn't just a defamation lawsuit. It was a message to anyone who thought they could tear down the things she had fought so hard for. It was a stand, one she would take, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. Over the next few weeks, the media frenzy surrounding the case grew more intense. Eva's face appeared on the front pages of newspapers, her name splashed across digital headlines. But rather than the sympathy she might have expected, the stories painted her as the villain. The accusations, some of them so outlandish they seemed impossible to believe, became the talk of the town. People began questioning her credibility, wondering if the foundation had ever truly been about helping others, or if it was just a vehicle for Eva's personal gain. Luca's narrative had taken root like a weed in the garden of her reputation, and it spread quickly, fueled by social media and the sensationalism of the press. His accusations were so specific, so calculated, they threatened to tarnish everything she had fought for. Yet, even as the pressure mounted, Eva kept her focus on what mattered most. During the legal proceedings, she was forced to recount, in painful detail, the betrayal she had experienced when Luca had walked out on her. He had distanced himself from her after the accident, leaving her to rebuild alone. And now, years later, he was coming for her foundation, the very thing that had given her a sense of purpose when she had nothing left. But through it all, Eva refused to let him break her again. As the court dates loomed closer, she continued to work relentlessly on behalf of the foundation. There were lives to be changed, families to be helped, and she could not afford to let Luca's lies derail that. Every new email from a donor, every call from a patient who had received therapy, every letter of gratitude from someone whose life had been touched by Rise. Those were the moments that kept her going. One afternoon, after a particularly exhausting day in court, Eva sat at her desk, her hands resting on the smooth surface of the wood, looking out the window of her office. The view was tranquil, overlooking the rolling hills that surrounded the Rise Foundation's new center. But her thoughts were far from peaceful. "Don't let them win," she whispered to herself, the words almost a prayer. The thought of Luca's betrayal, his attempt to tarnish her name, filled her with a simmering anger. But she knew she couldn't let it consume her, not when there was so much at stake. As she reflected on her journey, she reminded herself that this battle wasn't about winning against Luca. It was about protecting the lives of those who relied on Rise. And in that moment, she realized that no matter what the outcome of the lawsuit, she had already won. She had built something that could not be taken away by any rumor, by any false accusation. The weeks wore on, and the legal battle seemed to stretch endlessly, a tiring war of words and accusations. But Eva, surrounded by her unwavering team, never wavered. Her confidence in her work and her mission remained strong. She kept her focus on the long-term goal, ensuring that the Rise Foundation could continue to grow, continue to serve, and continue to heal. Then came the day when the verdict was announced. The courtroom was full, the air thick with anticipation. Eva sat at the front, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Jonathan sat beside her, his expression calm but professional. The judge's voice broke the silence. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Eva Matthews. Luca Romano's statements regarding the Rise Foundation were indeed defamatory, and the evidence provided sufficiently demonstrates malicious intent to harm the integrity of the foundation. The court orders that Mr. Romano cease all defamatory actions and pay a monetary settlement for damages. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. There was no burst of celebration, no exhale of relief, just a quiet nod from Eva. She had won. But the battle had never truly been about winning. It had been about protecting what she had built. It had been about defending the truth. As she walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the lawsuit finally lifted from her shoulders, but she knew that this victory wasn't the end. There would always be those who tried to tear her down, those who sought to destroy what she had fought so hard to create. But she had learned something vital over the years. She was stronger than any of them. And with the foundation's reach now growing beyond anything she had ever imagined, she knew there was only one direction left for her to go: forward. The Rise Foundation would continue to rise, just as she had. The grand hall was filled with voices, laughter, and the hum of anticipation. It was the most significant event the Rise Foundation had ever hosted, a celebration of its growth, of the countless lives it had touched, and of the vision that had started with nothing but a woman's resilience and a desire to make a difference. The floor was lined with guests in elegant attire, but the true stars of the evening were not the donors, the board members, or the dignitaries in attendance. No, the stars were the people whose lives had been transformed by the foundation's work. Eva Matthews stood at the podium, her gaze sweeping over the crowd as her heart swelled with pride. The room before her was a testament to everything she had fought for, the faces of those whose lives had been forever changed by the Rise Foundation. From the elderly man who had regained the use of his legs after a devastating stroke, to the young mother who had learned to walk again after a tragic car accident, to the teenagers finding their confidence after spinal injuries, the impact was immeasurable. They were all here, standing as proof that healing, though difficult, was possible. Her voice echoed through the room as she spoke, calm and strong, yet filled with the deep emotion that had been building within her for years. Tonight, Eva began, we celebrate not just the progress we've made, but the people who have made this journey possible. The true value of this foundation isn't in the awards we've received, the money we've raised, or the recognition we've gained. It's in the lives we've touched. It's in the stories of healing, hope, and courage that continue to unfold day by day here at Rise. What we have built together is more than just a foundation. It is a movement of empowerment. The applause that followed was warm, heartfelt. But Eva's eyes drifted to the side of the room where she spotted him, Luca. He was standing near the back, seemingly lost in the crowd, but his gaze was fixed on her. The expression on his face was a mixture of regret, guilt, and something deeper, perhaps an understanding of just how much he had lost. His presence didn't stir anger in her anymore, but something else entirely. Compassion, maybe. Or perhaps the quiet realization that she had long since moved beyond the past they had shared. Eva had not expected to see Luca here tonight, though she knew that despite everything, he still kept tabs on her progress. He'd been following the news of the Rise Foundation's success, and as she had suspected, guilt had driven him to make an appearance. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the room, but Eva didn't falter. She didn't allow the past to pull her back, not even for a second. She had built something far greater than the hurt he had once caused her. Luca's appearance at the event didn't stir the bitterness she might have once felt, nor did it bring back the waves of anger she had experienced during their divorce and the legal battle. Instead, it brought a kind of quiet peace, a moment of clarity. She had moved on, not because she had forgiven him, but because she had found something far more powerful than the resentment she might have carried. She had found purpose, and with it, the freedom to live on her own terms. The night continued with speeches from other key figures within the foundation: volunteers, board members, therapists. But it was the stories from the beneficiaries that left the deepest impression. One by one, individuals took the stage, sharing their personal journeys. Some had been paralyzed in accidents, others had suffered from long-term conditions that limited their mobility. But all of them spoke with one voice. The Rise Foundation had given them the tools to reclaim their lives. A young man, no older than 25, stood up and addressed the crowd. His hands shook slightly as he gripped the microphone, but his words were clear and strong. "I was in a car accident 2 years ago. I was told I would never walk again. The Rise Foundation didn't just teach me to walk. It taught me to live again," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Eva Matthews gave me back my life, and for that, I will be forever grateful." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words settling over everyone. Eva smiled softly, her heart full, her chest tight. This, she thought, was what it was all about. This was why she had put everything into building the foundation, so that others could have the same second chance she had, so that people who had lost hope could find it again. As the night drew to a close, Eva took a moment to reflect on how far she had come, from the woman who had been left broken and abandoned in a hospital room to the woman standing here, stronger than ever, at the helm of a thriving organization. The woman who had once feared she might never find her place in the world again now stood at the forefront of a movement that was changing lives. Her journey had not been easy, but it had been hers. And in reclaiming her life, she had helped countless others reclaim theirs. Luca never approached her during the event. He remained on the periphery, never attempting to intrude. The silence between them spoke volumes. He had tried to come back into her life, but Eva had learned that forgiveness was not about reconciliation. It was about moving forward, and she had already done that. As the final applause rang out and the event came to a close, Eva stepped away from the stage, her heart light, her mind clear. She walked toward the exit, but just before she left, she felt a hand gently touch her shoulder. It was Jonathan, her ever-present friend, confidant, and now the Foundation's vice president. "You did it, Eva," he said softly. "You've created something that will outlast all of us. Your legacy is secure. You're changing the world." Eva nodded, a smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I didn't do it alone. She gestured to the bustling crowd and the glowing walls of the Rise Foundation's headquarters. "This is all of us. Together, we're rewriting the story of what's possible." And with that, Eva walked into the night, the quiet sound of her footsteps echoing softly in the hall behind her, a symbol of the legacy she had built and the new chapter she was about to begin. She had faced loss, betrayal, and the unimaginable. But through it all, Eva Matthews had built something far more powerful than she had ever dreamed. And she had become something she could have never anticipated, not just a survivor, but a beacon of empowerment and hope for others. Her purpose was no longer defined by what had been taken from her, but by what she had given to the world. And that was all that mattered. Eva Matthews' story is one of profound struggle, yet it is also filled with hope and incredible strength. From a woman abandoned, broken by pain and loss, Eva found the strength to rise, rebuild her life, and create a legacy no one could erase. She is not only a testament to resilience, but an inspiration to all of us, that in every challenge, every hardship, we have the power to rise and find strength in what seems impossible. Eva refused to let her past define her future. She chose to rewrite her story, and in doing so, she has inspired thousands, perhaps even millions of others to do the same. This story is proof of the power of perseverance, self-worth, and the capacity to heal that resides within each of us. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like, share this video with those around you, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue exploring stories of human strength and positive transformation together. We all have the ability to change, to start anew, and to create a brighter future. Be the motivation for yourself and for others. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story. Don't forget to hit subscribe and like so you never miss a video from us. Together, let's rise for a better world.